this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing a double book review of two fairy tale inspired novels that both have a very classic fairy tale, once upon a time, any number of inexplicable magical things could happen sort of feel to them. These are books that I think kind of bookended the year of 2024 for me. The first book in this video, A Warning About Swans by Romero, was my first 5-star read of 2024. When I read it back in February of 2024, I wanted to do a full review of this. I wrote my review and then kept just not reading any books that I felt would be a good pairing with this one, that I also wanted to write a full written review for. Until the end of the year came around, when the very last book that I read in December was The Raven and the Reindeer by Kingfisher, which is a backlist title that I've had on my shelves for years. This is a retelling of The Snow Queen. This was published in 2016 and so far has not been picked up for a major publisher reissue like some of Kingfisher's backlist books have been. Kingfisher has gained a massive amount of popularity in the last few years through some recent releases that got a lot of attention, but I think a lot of those new readers don't really know her backlist very well, and so I thought this would be a really good idea to give a spotlight to one of her older indie published backlist titles. Starting off with A Warning About Swans, though, this was a book that I picked up on a whim because it was on sale from Barnes & Noble. I knew nothing about it except that it looked gorgeous, and I was very intrigued by the description. This was a 2023 release that really didn't get a lot of attention, and so I would like to draw some attention to it. I'll admit that this effortlessly beautiful YA fairy tale novel in verse earns its 5 stars from me more on account of checking a lot of my personal boxes rather than challenging me or offering me new ideas. But I'm well over the target age for YA at this point. And something that's predictable and comforting for me very well may still be new and challenging for a younger reader. A Warning About Swans is the story of a teenage animal maiden, a swan, of course, whose coming of age involves an adventure in the human world in which she seeks her freedom from a fate not of her choosing, trusts the wrong boy a little too much, and loses something of herself that she must dig deep into her inner strength to reclaim. The book's marketing compares it to Swan Lake and the Last Unicorn, but if you've read any Selkie stories or their ilk, you'll recognize their influence here as well, along with a few other myths and legends. This book has a somewhat sparse amount of text per page. I mentioned that it's told in verse and the lines are fairly short, so I hope this focuses well enough that you can see about how much text per page there is. So it's a much quicker read than it looks. And it's fairly skeletal on actual plot detail, relying instead on raw emotions and key moments to convey a story that spreads many months and multiple locales. I personally think that the book description provided by the publisher gives away a smidge too much of the plot, going so far as to reference a plot event that happens well over the halfway mark, so I hope to be forgiven for sharing much less detail here. Hilda is the youngest of 6 sisters dreamed into being by Odin and granted the ability to shift into swan form, along with magical gifts that they are tasked to use as custodians of the forest in which they live and the animals they share it with. Hilda's gift, however, is darker than her sister's, the gift of easing death and guiding souls to the other wood. Alienated and lonely, she makes a deal with a human boy hungry for the wealth and power that he sees in her magic, casts aside her swan form and makes her way into the human world of 19th century Bavaria. The feminist take on traditional stories isn't so new these days. In fact, it's practically expected. But I don't think that's all R.M. Romero is doing here. Hilda's eventual romance with a non-binary artist who sees her clearly even when she's trying to hide her magic is very sweet. And there are subtle themes in this plot line about the power of art and the meanings we find in stories, as well as grief, faith, and identity. Historical detail is admittedly a little sparse, though I could never quite decide if I wanted more of it or actually preferred the Once Upon a Time fairy tale treatment of the historical characters and real-world locales for overall consistency with the style of the book, but perhaps a historical note or something similar in the back of the book for curious younger readers wouldn't have been amiss. Romero's writing in verse is very beautiful and creative, but was never so dense as to slow me down while reading, except to read certain passages aloud, or make me worry that I'd missed something important. This is very accessible poetry for anyone worried that might be a barrier. And wow, was it ever just a lovely, lovely reading experience. It's always such a pleasant surprise to pick up something that you haven't heard much about and to have it just absolutely wow you, and that was my experience with this book. Moving on to The Raven and the Reindeer, this one belongs to a category of fairy tale retelling that really appeals to me. Stories that follow more or less the plot structure of the original, but invert and reinvent the spirit and ethos at every turn. This actually stands in stark contrast for me with T. Kingfisher's most recently published fairy tale novel, A Sorceress Comes to Call, which is ostensibly a Goose Girl retelling, but only in the loosest possible sense. I gave both books, A Sorceress Comes to Call and The Raven and the Reindeer, 4-star ratings. But this is actually my preferred style of retelling. Though I should caveat that by saying that I have actually never read Anderson's original Snow Queen in full. It's rather long for a classic fairy tale and also overtly religious, both of which put me off. So my knowledge of the story comes from plot summaries online and perhaps also an abridged illustrated version that I remember very fuzzily from years ago. But I do still know the basic shape and story of the original. But in this version of the story, we follow teenage Gerda, who fancies herself in love with the neighbor boy Kay, who has been her playmate her whole life. Kay doesn't really deserve Gerda's devotion, but Gerda doesn't really have any other close friends, so she doesn't know better. When the Snow Queen steals Kay away in the night, Gerda is the only witness, so she leaves home on a perilous quest to find the legendary Snow Queen and rescue him, knowing only that she must travel north. The story is pretty clearly set in Finland during some once upon a time era with no concrete cities, towns, or historical events mentioned. But of course the Snow Queen's fortress itself cannot be found on any mortal map and must be reached by other means than regular travel. As in the original, Gerda meets a number of people and animals along the way in somewhat episodic fashion, with almost all the major players from the fairy tale accounted for in some form or other. Most notable in this lineup are probably Mousebones the Raven, who is delightful, and Yana, the robber girl of the fairy tale, who in this version becomes Gerda's eventual love interest. Both join Gerda on her quest and travel with her all the way to her final confrontation at the Snow Queen's palace. Also, there are weird and charming magical plant dreams. I cannot elaborate, you must discover them for yourself. There are some ideas here that aren't as fully explored as I imagine they would be if Kingfisher were writing this today, knowing what I know of her more recent work. In particular, we get a few different adult perspectives on Gerda's quest. The most interesting being the witch from early in the story who ensorcels Gerda for months, ostensibly to keep her safe from this too perilous journey. But Gerda's kindly grandmother, who raised her, sends her off on this quest in the beginning with very little compunction. And the reasoning behind this is never really explored. Given how deeply Kingfisher's later work has grappled with adult characters' responsibility towards young protagonists, I was a bit surprised. Now, when this book first came on my radar some years ago, I think it was represented to me as a darker, bloodier retelling. In retrospect, that was likely before Kingfisher started publishing actual horror, and so the measure that fans of her books would use may have shifted a bit since then. It actually strikes me as one of her more whimsical books I've read that isn't overtly for young readers. And despite the youth of the protagonist, I'd categorize this as adult. But I think even The Seventh Bride, which was originally published 2 years prior to this in 2014, has some more genuinely horrific moments. That said, there is animal death and reindeer gore in this one, as well as the violent killing of a human who was pretty terrible and had it coming, but still. So it's not for the very squeamish. Overall, I would describe this as a very classic coming-of-age fantasy, as well as a retelling that taps into fairy tale nostalgia. Gerda undergoes a series of transformations from the mundane ordeal of growing older to the extremely magical, gradually earning the wisdom she needs to triumph. It's a quick read, but a satisfying one, and if you're like me, you won't particularly care that you can see where the story is going a mile away. With any good retelling, it doesn't particularly matter that you know where the story is going. The journey is what counts. So that is my double book review for A Warning About Swans and The Raven and the Reindeer. I forgot to mention at the beginning that these are both queer, although that's one of the reasons I decided to pair them together. But I hope that was clear in both of the reviews. These were both standout fairy tale reads for me. Let me know if you've read either of them and what you think. Let me know if you're planning on reading them. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.